But first, let's talk to the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who joins me in the studio. Good morning, Foreign Secretary.
Good morning.
Where is the military balance this morning?
Well, what we're seeing that the Ukrainian forces are continuing to resist Russian advances. We haven't seen overnight significant changes in what is happening on the ground, but we are seeing, I think, unexpected by the Russians, very, very strong and brave Ukrainian resistance. And it's our role as key supporters of Ukraine to continue to supply them with defensive weapons, continue to supply them with economic support to help them resist this egregious invasion.
To what extent do you think that Mr. Putin has failed to object his first, 3-day objectives?
Well, we said before this invasion took place that Vladimir Putin would be making a massive strategic mistake. First of all, because the Ukrainians would fight. And we're seeing them fight. We're seeing the incredibly brave leadership of President Zelensky. But also because they would be hit by severe Western sanctions. And last night, the G7 agreed that we would cut access for Russia to the SWIFT banking system, that we would target the Russian central bank, that we'll be putting more sanctions on oligarchs and companies. And you can see the reaction in the international markets. You can see the damage already to the Russian economy. But I fear, Trevor, that this will be a long haul. What I'm saying, though, is that the United Kingdom absolutely stands by Ukraine through this very long and difficult conflict.
By the way, when you talked about long haul, it's reported this morning you said that this could be 10 years.
This could be a number of years. Because what we do know is Russia have strong forces, but we know that the Ukrainians are brave, that they're determined to stand up for their sovereignty and territorial integrity, and they're determined to fight. And the sanctions that we are putting in place, and they are very, very tough sanctions, cutting the Russian economy at its knees, cutting access to the Western system. We've banned Aeroflot from flying into the United Kingdom. We're targeting key oligarchs. We've got a hit list of oligarchs. But these will take time to have an effect and debilitate the Russian economy. We need to wean Europe off Russian oil and gas. This will take time. So this is not going to be, I fear, over quickly, but we need to be prepared for a very long haul.
I want to come to the sanctions question in a moment, but sticking with a military issue, what actual military support are we offering to Ukraine?
So we've trained up 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers. We've put support into the Ukrainian Navy. We've supplied anti-tank weapons, which are being used by the Ukrainians. And we continue to supply defensive weaponry for the Ukrainians to use. We've also the Defence Secretary led a donor conference on Friday with 25 other countries. They have pledged also to support. And last night we saw that Germany has changed its position. Germany is now going to be supplying defensive weapons into Ukraine. So we're seeing a huge uptick. And Britain really has led in this. We were the first country in Europe to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine. We're now seeing others supply defensive weapons as well. And this is vitally important to help the Ukrainians resist the Russian invasion and the Russian advance. And what we're also seeing is just the huge motivation of the Ukrainian forces. They are fighting for their country, but they're also fighting for freedom and democracy. And it's vitally important that Putin's ambitions stop in Ukraine. He's stated publicly that he wants to regain control of vast swathes of Eastern Europe, whether it's Poland, Moldova, the Baltics. We must make sure that we are doing all we can to back the Ukrainian resistance.
There's clearly, as you say, great resistance here. But one of the things that I think is now being contemplated is if the Russians feel that they are being frustrated, their response might not be to step back. It might be to deploy greater firepower. How serious do you think this could become?
I fear you are absolutely right, Trevor. We've already seen the response from the Russian government. We've seen the actions taken despite all of the warnings about the severe cost of this conflict in terms of humanitarian cost, in terms of cost for the Russian state. I mean, this could well be the beginning of the end for Putin. And I fear that he is determined to use the most unsavoury means in this war. But he should be aware that the International Criminal Court is already looking at what is happening in Ukraine. And there will be serious consequences for him personally and for the Russian government.
How far do you think he can go? I mean, he has chemical, biological weapons. He has nuclear weapons. How bloody could this actually become?
I fear this conflict could be very, very bloody. And we've already seen civilians targeted by the Russian government. I urge the Russians not to escalate this conflict, but we do need to be prepared for Russia to seek to use even worse weapons. I think it would be hugely devastating. Russia is already isolated internationally. At the UN Security Council, not a single country voted with Russia. Everybody is dissociating themselves from Russia. They are being cut off from the international community, financially, diplomatically, politically, and that would simply make it even worse.
We saw in Syria the use of chemical weapons, banned weapons. Could that be a factor here? And, one doesn't want to over-dramatise this, but let's be frank. Ukraine was the site of many what used to be called battlefield nuclear weapons. Are we talking, in worst circumstances, that kind of carnage?
We need to avoid this at all costs. This is why it is so important, the work we are doing to degrade the Russian military complex. We're stopping the export of technologies to Russia. We are stopping the ability of those military companies to raise money in the international markets. We're cutting off the SWIFT system from Russia, precisely so that they cannot fund this war machine anymore.
We have said that we're standing shoulder to shoulder. We are going to do everything for Ukrainians. Well, of course, one of the consequences of this action, even before any of the kinds of things we've just been talking about happens, will be a flow of refugees. 150,000 apparently have left. The UN talked about 5 million. Some of those people will want to come here. What are we going to do to admit those people from Ukraine who maybe have families here? At the moment, the visa regime seems extremely bureaucratic and restrictive. Have you any thought about how it's going to be made easier for people to flee?
Well, the Prime Minister has already been very clear that we are a country that welcomes refugees, that we will do all we can to support the Ukrainians. We're already putting in a lot of humanitarian assistance at the border. Of course, the main thing we can do is support the Ukrainians to fight for their country so that they can have a long-term future in Ukraine. That's extremely important, Trevor.
But telling people whose families are here, who are Ukrainian, who want to bring their families out, that you have to apply for a seasonal worker visa does not sound that welcoming.
We are looking at what more we can do, Trevor. And the Prime Minister was very clear last night that we will be welcoming refugees from Ukraine. We're already expediting our visa processes, our passport processes. We've got a 24/7 operation running at the Foreign Office, helping people with emergency travel documents. But I can tell you, Trevor, we are looking at what more we can do.
But come on, you better
we'll be saying more about this very shortly.
Well, I hope you might want to say something about that today, because today, people in Ukraine are saying, we have to travel to Lviv to get a visa in Ukraine. If we want a British visa, we have to get out of Ukraine to Poland or Romania or Moldova. That is not easy. That is not welcoming. Why not simply say that people who can get from Ukraine to here, who have relatives, who have a place to go, will have at least a temporary visa, and then you can do the investigations and all of that. Why not be clear about it today? Because in Kyiv, what they're hearing is the British aren't that keen on you coming.
Well, first of all, I can completely say that is not true. the United Kingdom does welcome refugees, and we want to do all we can to support Ukraine. Economically, we're supporting the humanitarian effort. I had a call last night with the United Nations about how we support making sure the humanitarian response is completely in place, how we protect humanitarian corridors out of Ukraine. So we are doing all that work. I know it's difficult, and I completely appreciate the difficult of communications in Ukraine. There is an online system that people can use to apply for visas. But as I say, we are looking urgently, Trevor, we're looking urgently at what more we can do to support people in Ukraine. But I want to send a very strong message. The United Kingdom welcomes refugees.
Our people on the ground in Ukraine are not... are hearing from people in Ukraine that that is not the message they're hearing. What they're hearing is it's difficult to come to Britain. And after they've complained that we were a bit slow in getting the weapons and all the rest of it, it's not a great look for us, is it?
Well, can I just pull you up on the point about the defensive weapons? We were the first. We were the first European country to send defensive weapons to Ukraine. We have had a long-term programme of training up the Ukrainian armed forces. We're now seeing other European countries also send defensive weapons, which is very welcome. We were the first country to call for SWIFT to be cut out from the Russians. We have put in the toughest package of sanctions of any European country. So we will always lead, and we will also lead, Trevor, on the humanitarian and the refugee effort. And I can guarantee that to you today.
All right, let's come on to your ground, which is a diplomatic territory. There are reports that the Belarusians have tried to open some conversation with the Ukrainians today. What do we know of that, and what do you think this means?
Well, what we know is throughout the diplomatic discussions we've been having, the Russians have lied. When I was in Moscow, I was assured by Sergei Lavrov there would be no invasion of Ukraine. That was not true. President Putin said there would be no invasion of Ukraine. That is not true. So what we know is that the Russians weren't and aren't serious about diplomacy. This is why our efforts should be focused on supporting the Ukrainians fight in Ukraine to defend their country and cutting off the Russian economy from the international system and degrading the Russian economy. Now, if the Russians are serious about negotiations, they need to remove their troops from Ukraine. They cannot negotiate with a gun to the head of the Ukrainians. They need to remove their troops, which is what they call for. They need to de-escalate this conflict. And I see absolutely no signs of that. We're continuing to see a Russian offensive in Ukraine. So frankly, I don't trust these so-called efforts of negotiation.
So no talks until there's a complete withdrawal?
Absolutely.
You've talked about the sanctions already. You and I have discussed those sanctions before. You've obviously had some success with getting other countries to do something about the SWIFT system. The other sanctions that we might be looking at are, for example, in relation to energy. In 2014, David Cameron, along with other European leaders, vowed to reduce our dependence on Russian energy supplies. In 2014, we in the UK actually bought 0 cubic metres from Russia. In the last year, we bought 6.4 billion cubic metres. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that actually we applied sanctions, but in fact we bought more gas from Russia. Why is it going to be any different this time?
So we currently, I think 3% of our energy supplies are Russian gas, which is a lot lower than many European countries. I mean, some are up to 85% of all their gas comes from Russia. So what we need to do is we need to agree with our G7 counterparts, because we're not going to be able to do this alone. We need to agree to reduce that percentage over time. That's what's important. So I would support the idea of having ceilings on how much oil and gas is imported from Russia. So over time, we cut the dependency right across Europe. And that's what we're working with our G7 partners. But you're absolutely right, Trevor, that the West did not follow through.
Yeah.
And that is why
things went in the wrong direction.
That's why we're in the situation we're in now, is we didn't do enough to deter Putin in 2008 and 2014. And that is why our sanctions will be much tougher. That is why the Germans in particular have cancelled Nord Stream 2. They're now supplying defensive weapons. We've seen a huge change, which I very much welcome, because we need to take a different approach. We simply cannot afford to be importing Russian oil and gas. We cannot afford to have such a strong Russian presence in our financial system. That is why we're prepared to take tough actions that will ultimately be difficult for our economy in the short term, but will help protect freedom and democracy in the long term.
Yes, but if I may say so, I think that all sounds right and good, but the problem is that it went in the wrong direction last time. You have to work with other people. And I suppose...
We're not going to let it go in the wrong direction this time. I am absolutely determined, Trevor. The Prime Minister is absolutely determined not to let it happen again.
Brian O'Toole, who was the Treasury official charged with essentially leading on the devising sanctions regime after 2014, said to me in an interview that we're going to run later in this programme that actually you have to understand that there are limits to what sanctions can do. They knew that they couldn't get Putin out of Crimea in 2014 with sanctions. What they hoped to do, and what he thought they did, was to delay further aggressions. What is our real objectives with sanctions here? He's not going to back out of Ukraine because of sanctions, is he?
The real objective is to degrade the Russian economy, because what we know is that Putin's war machine is funded by revenues from oil and gas. So what we have to do is reduce dependency on oil and gas. We have to cut the ability of Russia to raise money on the international financial markets. We're cutting the technology that they can use in their military complex. They've got very advanced weapons. We're going to stop them accessing Western technology. So over a period of time, it's harder and harder for Putin to fund his army, harder and harder for him to create that new technology, and harder and harder for him to wage war. But I completely agree with your analysis that this will take time.
All right.
This is why I'm saying this is going to be a long-running conflict. The Ukrainians are and will resist. It's very, very hard for Russia to gain permanent control over Ukraine when the public of Ukraine do not want that. And this is why we warned Putin that this would be a long-running quagmire. Right. But the role of sanctions is degrading the Russian economy over time.
All right, let's talk about a couple of things that we can do. When, again, we last spoke, you said that there would be nowhere to hide for Putin's associates, the oligarchs. Now, Roman Abramovich has relinquished control of Chelsea Football Club, but he still owns it. And that means that if you come after his assets, for an example, if you were to come after his assets, Chelsea Football Club would be beyond your reach. In truth, unless you change the way that all companies operate in London, the oligarchs and their British lawyers will still be able to protect their assets, won't they?
Well, this week we'll be introducing the Economic Crime Bill, which will create a lot more transparency around the structures of these companies and make it much clearer what is going on. I've compiled a hit list of oligarchs, people who...
Is Abramovich on it?
I'm not going to say who is on the list, but what I can tell you is there are over 100 billionaires in Russia. We have compiled a hit list of oligarchs. We're working through and putting the cases together. And every few weeks, we will sanction new oligarchs. There will be a rolling programme of sanctions. We will go through the hit list. We're targeting oligarchs' private jets. We'll be targeting their properties. We'll be targeting other possessions that they have. And there will be nowhere to hide.
All right, look, lastly, everybody knows Newton's law. To every action, there's a reaction. We'll do the sanctions and so on. It's estimated that energy bills might now climb to 3,000. We can expect inflation above 8%. Ukraine produces grain, price of bread will rise. So there will be a cost to all of this for us. I wonder, for us to make a difference, our people are going to have to face some suffering, some consequences. Are you going to level with the British people that in order to force change in Moscow, people in Manchester and Maidstone and Merthyr Tydfil, anywhere else begins with M, are going to make sacrifices in this country as for what Neville Chamberlain once described as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of which we know nothing? Are you going to be clear with Britain that if we're going to fight this long battle, they are going to have to sacrifice?
Well, first of all, the sacrifices that we are going to have to undertake in Britain are nothing like the sacrifices that people in Ukraine are suffering now. You know, they are having to arm themselves, they are having to fight on the streets due to a completely unprovoked invasion by the Russians. And my thoughts are with the people of Ukraine and the difficult struggle that they have ahead of them. But we're not just fighting for the people of Ukraine and the sovereignty and self-determination of Ukraine. This long-running conflict is about freedom and democracy in Europe. Because if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, we are going to see others under threat. The Baltics, Poland, Moldova, and it could end up in a conflict with NATO. We do not want to go there. That is why it's so important that we make the sacrifices now. And yes, there will be an economic cost here in Britain. There will be a cost in terms of access to oil and gas markets. We don't import much here, but there are a lot of imports into continental Europe from Russian gas, so inevitably there will be impacts. But we have to, and I firmly believe the British public understand the price we would pay if we don't stand up to Putin now. The price we would pay is much greater in the long term. And frankly, over the past 15 years, we haven't done enough to stand up to Putin. We're now facing the reality of what that means. And that is why we are taking a much tougher stand now.
Liz Truss, thank you very much.
Thank you.